Welcome. I'm Jessica Tietjen, and this is the Evolving to Exceptional podcast, where we talk about reaching peak performance in our workplaces, homes, and communities so that we can live our best life possible, an exceptional life. All right. I want to welcome back our Evolving to Exceptional listeners to another episode this week with a fantastic guest, Monica Lummus. She is the global HR leader, the global HR business partner at Brillio. Is that how you say it, Monica?
Yep, you got it.
Brillio. And we are going to talk a bit today about some of the challenges and some of the things that we need to focus on when it comes to leaders and managers and people in those kind of middle roles, not necessarily like the top leader roles, but the development of those middle managers and some of the gaps that we're seeing in that space and continue to see in that space. But before we get into kind of that topic on a deeper level, Monica, I want to give you a chance to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, why it is you do what you do, what makes you passionate about it. Just give us a sense of who you are and the role that you're performing.
Sure. My name is Monica Lummus, and my current role is Senior HR Business Partner for Brillio. I've been in HR field, I'm getting about 28 years now, so it's a very long time. And most of my experience has been in the global technology consulting professional services space. So no manufacturing, none of that. I didn't start off in HR, actually. I started off really wanting to be a buyer in retail and textile and apparel management. But talking about passions, my father's a psychologist, and he really helped me understand that I really enjoy helping and working with people. That's where my true passion and talent lies. And so I pursued human resources, and I've had a really, so far, a long and great career, and I've been able to pursue many different roles at different companies. And I've touched a lot of areas of HR. I've even worked in a talent management COE, but so I have a lot of experience in a lot of areas and continue to work in the field and find ways to add value and really enhance the employee experience.
Yeah. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what you're currently seeing. What are some of those challenges or those things that that organizations are dealing with, like yours, around people and performance and talent management?
Yeah, so I think the way, at least in our market, the way the economy has been going, but we're a very remote workforce, and the people that work for a company work for clients. So they're either working from home now, right? Or they're going to the client sites or on a hybrid model. And so they're not in an office, right, with me every day. And I think that's a classic. Maybe more people with the pandemic than HR had to struggle with how to engage their employees. But I feel like in professional services, we've always struggled with, because we've always had people that were at the client sites. They're not coming to our office every day. We have an office. And so it's not necessarily a new problem. I think the pandemic and the more work from home model made it just even a little more challenging to gather people and keep them engaged. It's a classic issue of, do people often feel like they don't even work for our company because they're very embedded with the client. They're there to serve the client. They're on site. Their problems are our problems now, right? And so for me, I think a challenge has always been that sense of belonging to your actual company. Who gives your paycheck, and where can you add value and maybe incent people to feel like they are part of this company? So it's like, why would I want to feel like I'm part of the company? I'm here to do client work. So those are common challenges that we've always faced. I've had the opportunity at this company. It's smaller than where I've worked in the past. I've worked at large, several 100,000 companies, whereas this one is maybe 5,000 to 6,000. And my group of people, rather than being 1,500, is more like 300. And so that has really given me the opportunity to connect a little more closely with our employees, build and develop relationships, and really coach and guide them on all the things about our company. It's a constant. It sounds odd that you have to sell your own employees on your own company because they're already here, right? They're already in the door. Keep them engaged. Why should I keep doing these things and investing in myself? And we're always rolling out these great tools in HR and trying to educate people on their own self-development and what we have to offer as far as learning and development and training and how they can be their best selves. And we take that tact, but it is still an ongoing struggle, right? I'm not going to lie. But from a retention and engagement standpoint, I think we really started to see a lot of rewards or ROI on time spent one-on-one with employees.
So there's a couple of things you brought up there that kind of stuck with me and I want to dive into a little bit, which is when it comes to engagement and what we're talking about when we're talking about, especially as you talk about professional services and not necessarily whether people are in the office together, but how do you create that sense of connection or that sense of relationship? And it makes me think a little bit about the different interpretations of that term engagement and what it is that people really want or really need, and not necessarily that those two things are the same, because what we need isn't always what we want and vice versa. And it makes me think a little bit about the idea that people, what is the underlying or the inherent value in creating that level of engagement or those connections and those relationships? Do people need to feel like they belong as part of the community and the organization? What is it that we're trying? What are those needs that we're trying to meet of our people, of our population? What have you noticed, maybe in terms of your people and your experience, is important to people about that? And what's the underlying, not necessarily what we're doing to accomplish it, but what is the underlying reason in which we talk about and want to accomplish it?
Okay, so there's a lot there. So you're right. Sometimes engagement is, a very loose, generic term. I love it when people have come around to the employee experience, because your experience here, it's different for everyone, and everyone has different values and what they want out of that experience. Some of our employees don't want to have anything to do with us, or they want to just leave me alone. I just want to do my job. And you figure that out through different interactions. And those are the times that you just realize that's okay. Not everybody wants to engage with you in that same way. And you're right. Some people really seek and want that sense of belongingness, where we do have offices. They want to come in every Friday and take part in the little celebrations and that sort of thing. And other people, they've never been to an office and they could care less. And so it is a challenge to figure out what level of belongingness or what it is that will keep people working here. One of my previous companies, somebody developed this really cool little checklist for managers when they met with their employees, where they had them list it was like a list of top 5 or 10 things that you number 1 through 10 or 1 through 5 of your level of importance, and then how you're actually feeling about them today and seeing where they match, because everyone balance compensation, interaction with my manager, mobility, different things. And so it really was something that called to light very quickly what matters to that person, and are they getting those needs met here? Now, as an HR person, I'm not as involved in our employees' day-to-day lives or their work lives. It's their managers, right, that are generally the ones that they're really interacting with, and they're really impacting their experiences, right? I can talk to them and ask them once or twice a year how it's going and feed them as much as I can during these conversations and education. And that has actually helped build some trust and relationship for employees. So when they do need or want something that they're not getting from their manager, or maybe that they just need something else, they do know who to come to and what to expect, or how to, maybe I've ignited some curiosity in them about how they can develop their careers. But the managers tend to be the ones, we hear that in research, but also tend to be the ones that really impact somebody's experience at a company. And they can't really escape their managers, right? They can escape me.
Right.
As you pinpointed questions and all that, but they can't escape the managers. And so, I always struggle, or maybe not struggle. Some people seem to be very natural people managers, and some people need some help, some training, some development, because your personality may not lend itself to being managed. Some people don't want to be managers, but they're managers. It's, hey, I want to be an individual contributor. Too bad. And so what do we do with that as an organization? How do we really ensure that people are having a good experience through their managers. And I think that's something that a lot of companies struggle with, right? We can't control everything, but I think I try to invest a lot of time in my middle managers or middle leaders because there is always the top down, right? And then it does stop. At least my experience has been a lot of things top down, imperatives, org structures, new ways of operating. They tend to stop at this middle level. And there is a true need at some of the lower levels of the company for people to understand the big picture, understand their part in the organization and how everything fits together. So there are so many things. I don't want to go up in too much of a tangent there, but when talking to people one-on-one, you do start to realize that maybe sometimes managers or some of us assume that people maybe don't care about certain things. And so then we don't share certain things. And so as a result, they're in the dark. Whereas really, I think that transparency by leaders needs to be there. I see information stopping and middle managers not being certain of what they can share, right, with people.
Mm.
And I'm a big believer in transparency as much as possible. I think it builds trust. And I think it's a level of respect that you're showing to people, right? And people do want to know more about how the organization works and where they are and who's doing what. I think the more that, well, at least at my company, different companies probably might be different, right? And there's certain things that probably shouldn't be shared. But I think as much as possible, middle managers and people managers need to feel more empowered to be able to share organizational structures and where things are going. And I think that truly does light up some people and it really fills that need. Not everyone, but some people.
And I think what's interesting about what you talked about there is the different needs that people believe that they have or the things that they want. And like you said, some people think that they just want to come to work and then go home and they don't care about the experience and things like that. And in my experience, some of that is tied more to a lack of understanding and awareness of why certain connection or types of relationships or a level of engagement is important and the impact that it has. And for example, when it comes to relationships and building relationships, when we have high degrees of trust between one another, when we have friendships and closer relationships, we interact differently with one another. We're more productive, we're more effective. We have less tendency to make assumptions that cause conflict or frustration or judgment, which means we get things done more effectively and with better outcomes. And not only that, ultimately the customers who we interact with can sense that. They can feel the difference between teams that work together really closely and enjoy working together versus those that are more fragmented or there's more challenges. And that's why Gallup uses one of their questions is the best friend at work question, super controversial, but they have kept it for decades because it's indicative of that. It measures that ability. So I think we sometimes underdevelop people to really understand why we're paying attention to the employee experience or why we want to create relationships or why we want to bring people together. And that it's not just for business reasons or it's not just for the company itself, but there's some underlying outcomes that take place.
Yeah. I was listening to another one of your podcasts, and there was that discussion that you brought up about the psychological safety and the cohesiveness of teams and that sense of belonging, like the best friend that you were talking about. And I definitely believe in all of that. It's true. You look at the different high performing teams and why are they so much more cohesive? Why every year are they knocking it out of the park, right? And they've developed within themselves, not necessarily anything the company did even, right? It's just that this group of people work together for a long period of time. So they can't help but develop certain relationships and cohesiveness too.
And then they're less likely to leave. People will stay in even toxic workplaces if they have a community and relationships that they feel really close to. They will stick it out because they like who they work with.
Oh, absolutely. I've been there. No.
Yeah. I think we've all been there at different points. So then the other thing you were talking about with managers, and I want to dive into this with you a little bit, is when we think about managers and even in some of our language, right? Like middle manager, the people that are lower in the organization, upper in the organization, it creates this almost hierarchy of relationship. And when we do that, I think it negates some of that belonging. It negates that, it creates a division, right? Like I'm at this level and this group is at this level. And so and it creates almost a superiority element. And when we think about managers, I've had a tendency to even move away from the term manager when it comes to people. And one of the reasons is because we do need managers to manage projects, to manage processes, to manage systems, to manage programs, to manage the execution of the work. We have to manage that. But when it comes to people actually don't respond very well to being managed, at least not being managed the way that we would manage tasks in a project. And so oftentimes what ends up happening, I think, and I want your thoughts on this, is managers end up responsible for a wide breadth of activities, all the way from management of the execution of the work to then performance of their people. And how do they optimize that? And how do they support that and cultivate that and develop those relationships and coach them? And we've said, okay, throughout history, we had these more traditional manager practices. And then we said that's insufficient. That doesn't really do enough for people. Let's just put on top of those same people. We need you to be their coach. We need you to help develop them. We need you to cultivate the culture and the community and the sense of belonging. And you've got to make sure people have respect. And we just keep piling on the expectations on these particular roles in that kind of hierarchical model versus maybe reinventing or rethinking how we're doing that or how we're approaching that. I'd just love to get some of your thoughts on that or on that idea.
Yeah, no, that's a great point because it's exactly like that. Company professional services, you might be managing a project end to end and the delivery of that project, but then you also have all these resources that you are responsible for their career, their annual rating, their performance, their everything, right? And it can be a lot of pressure and stress on one person. Some people rise to that and thrive in that space, and some people they just choose one or the other. And if it's professional services, they're going to choose the delivery of the project because it's the client that how we make our money, right? Other people are just going to be like, it's going to, manage themselves. There was a model that we had at one of my past companies that I absolutely loved. And I've seen some other companies try to pick up, and I'm sure there are other companies that do this, but I would love to get back to, we used to have the concept of career counselors, where somebody would have their manager, and it could change several times a year because you might be on 3 or 4 projects in a year.
Right.
So you can't really rely on one person to be responsible for your entire career. And so I love that concept of someone maybe being a little higher level manager, someone that had a lot of experience, but they would have a group of probably 5 to 8 people that they kept with the whole year. They managed their career. They were responsible for their annual rating. They would have the job of going to these other project managers and collecting that feedback and counseling them like a mentor, a coach, but also their manager. And so I love that concept because it does take some of that lifting off of the manager that's responsible for delivery. Yes, they're still going to have to manage the resources and the delivery of the project, but they're not necessarily responsible, so to speak. If they want to do it, they can, but if they don't, they know that so and so the career counselor has that ultimate responsibility. And so you're right, it is a lot. I think people though that are in this industry or been in this, at least people maybe not right out of college, right? But people that have been working in it 5, 10, 20 years, they're used to that model. But does it mean it's right? No, not necessarily. But it is a challenge. And I think that's why I've always struggled to try to come up with ways to enable our people manager capabilities in this environment, because it's in lieu of it changing, right, anytime soon. You have to find a way to at least arm them and empower them with things so they can actually feel, not feel like, so some people might feel very disengaged because they don't feel like they can do all of these things. And
Yeah.
that's how it is today. So they're like, I'm so overwhelmed. I have this, I have that. And one other reason for me to stay close to all these managers, because there's been so many times I've intervened and been like, hey, we need to look at your span of control. We need to talk to the main leader and say, you need to figure some of these reporting relationships out. John has way too many direct reports, or maybe John should be an individual contributor. We need to think about each person's experience and what's best for them. Maybe now is not a good time for this person to have 5 direct reports, right? They have something they need to accomplish. Maybe for 6 to 12 months, we're going to pull this out and let someone else manage some people. So it's an ongoing, I say struggle, but it's a challenge. And so I think there's not a lot of recognition by companies, like you're saying, this is like a big job. It's a lot for some people.
And what you said, the data proves that out, that managers are often can find themselves in the most, especially those that are stuck in the middle, the most disengaged, or that are struggling the most to manage their loads and what they're expected to be able to accomplish. And I think then that proves out in lots of unhappy people who talk about their ridiculous experiences with managers. And I have to believe that most managers, having been one and having been not a very good one when I first was a manager, because I didn't have any training or development before I became a manager the first time. So we become one, and then we mess up and we do things that are maybe not right, but we don't even realize the implications at the outset. And so you end up with almost this kind of like animosity, I think, between the two. And you end up with managers who are in roles, but maybe haven't gotten the development and the training that they need to really help them to be successful at what they're doing. And they're already strapped from a bandwidth and time standpoint, like we just talked about. And I continue to be surprised at how frequently managers are not equipped with either the training, the development, the coaching, or the skill sets they need to really be successful. And so they're trying to do their best, but they don't have the support that they need to know what are the things I really should do or shouldn't do. And the models that they've had before maybe aren't always the best models. So they're doing what they've seen, but it's not necessarily having the outcome or making the impact that they want it to have.
Yeah, I know that's so true. And being in HR, I think where we really see, and sometimes it's a maturity thing too, right? Is issues when things come up like sexual harassment or toxic workplace or those types of things where there's maybe not psychological safety, but the manager doesn't even know what that means, right? Or they don't even know, even though we ask people to take and require them to take this compliance training every year about harassment and the different laws and discrimination. I think a lot of times people, when they're not a manager, they just check a box. When they're finally in the manager seat, there's a big responsibility to ensure your team is not, some of those things pop up as well. And I've seen it many times with the manager not having the right training or really understanding the implications of some of those top sensitive areas, right? Will not know how or have the maturity or the training or the know-how to provide psychological safety, how to stand up for people, how to report on some sensitive areas, and things can really spiral.
So what are some of those, what are like the biggest gaps that you see come up the most in terms of people developers, people leaders and managers where of skills that are missing, of training and development that they really need to be successful, but time and time again, you find they don't have it?
The one I just mentioned, psychological safety. It is so important. I know it's a newer term, but it's always been there. We just maybe haven't called it that. But that whole term of psychological safety, people may be stuck in old fashioned, like you were saying, people had certain role models or certain ideas that they thought a manager was, right? Like maybe authoritarian or dictator like my way or the highway. Or I think some people, in lieu of not having training or knowing or having the luckiness to have a great manager, they're pulling from these traditional, antiquated ideas of what they think a manager is, right? Or should be. Like they need to have this authority and you have to listen to me. Whereas it's really more collaboration now, right? Like you said, it's not the hierarchy. It should be more of a collaborative. And everyone has different leadership styles, but you don't have to force people to do things. You can create this environment where people are happier and thriving, right? Understanding just basic diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding those things about what is harassment, all of those little things and recognizing them and being able to intervene when people are maybe disengaged too. I think there's this reluctance on the part of people, especially since we're all on work from home and not necessarily always together anymore, to delve into people's personal lives. And with good reason, right? Where is that line between your noticing a change in somebody, something's off, right? Asking how they're doing, or do you just, a lot of managers and people, they don't want to ask. They just want to like, and then something happens. They're like, oh, I did notice that they were not engaged or they changed, their personality totally changed. And I think there's a reluctance on some people's part to prod. They don't know the line and what they should or should not do and how they should check in on people's well-being and how they're doing. So I see that a lot too.
And I think what's interesting is from a neuroscience perspective. So the psychological safety term is interesting to me, right? Because it implies a little bit like it's in our head. And I want to maybe bring that down fully into the body, because the truth is that safety is a felt sense that exists throughout the entire body. So it's not necessarily perception of the experience, but it's my sense of safety in a particular environment, culture, relationship, and interaction. And the truth is, that has toxic practices and knows it, right? And consciously is aware of, hey, my workplace is a toxic workplace, and it's fine. I don't care. For the most part, I think there is a disconnect between what feels safe or what feels appropriate to some people and what feels or senses or people sense as safe for others. And so while an external person looking in can see and say, hey, this is a toxic environment and here's why, the people within it may not necessarily see it the same way. And especially leaders will typically not recognize it in their own organization.
That's
And so what ends up becoming really, I think, really important is educating leaders and people at large on what's happening from a neuroscience perspective when it comes to safety. What's happening is that our brains, our head brains, are processing all of the input and data and information that's coming in, both consciously and unconsciously, much of which is unconscious, very little of which is conscious. And so we're bringing all that information in and it's being filtered through our neural network. So it filters through our heart, so our emotions and our connections and relationships with others. And so that's going to tell us whether we feel happy or we feel scared or what is it that we're feeling. And do we feel like we belong? Do we feel like we're connected to the people that we're working with? And then you go down to that gut intelligence and the neural networks in our gut and our gut instinct. And we've all had that bad gut feeling or, ooh, that doesn't feel good, or that makes me really uneasy, or those different sensations that come. And then our gut is sending us a communication about, hey, is this leader safe? Is this situation safe? Is this workplace safe? And based upon that, not necessarily consciously, it can be totally unconsciously, it's going to impact how I operate, how transparent I am, how honest I am about my feelings and emotions, how I communicate about expectations, or how I give feedback in different situations. And so it's not about saying the right things when it comes to safety. It's not about having the right policy or procedure or how to deal with harassment and who to report it to. It's not necessarily about that, although those things are important, but it's also about how people experience the environment in those everyday interactions. And so I think there's a high level of education almost and awareness that has to happen for people of what are those triggers? Why do these things trigger people? why doesn't it trigger me, but it does trigger them? Maybe I need to be more aware of that when my voice goes up, that causes other people to shut down. Why is my voice going up? Is that something I can control? All these kind of nuanced elements that contribute to it that have nothing to do with necessarily the top line, party line communication, but everything to do with the everyday interactions.
No, you're right, because different people react to different mannerisms, voices, and ways of communication than others. And that's why I think, and what I've noticed is that this training on harassment, toxic workplace, all these trainings that we take every year, they've gotten significantly better, I've noticed, with the more focused on the examples and less the definition, because you're not going to learn the concepts of these things, right, or recognize them unless you see some really good scenarios played out for you. And I just noticed the other day we were looking at some new training that we were going to use a different vendor. And I was like, this is actually really good. Like they're getting so much better with the actors and the scenarios and how people feel and react. And it's given me a little more faith that maybe we're moving towards that, because you're right. People, we all have different experiences, but to see them in action, even if it's a fake, like acted event, they're becoming so much better now. So I think it is easier for people to recognize and put themselves in the shoes of different situations they're seeing. But you're right. There's so many factors.
And the thing that I think prevents organizations from getting there, and especially leaders and managers, is an unwillingness to do the self-reflection and to create the self-awareness. Because if I'm not willing to engage around how my responses, my reactions, my actions impact other people positively or negatively, then there is no dialogue to be had, right? If I'm going to shut down, if I can't look at, do I need to shift or change what I'm doing in order to better serve the people that I'm working with every day? And to me, when it comes to this challenge and this development of leaders and managers around this, it is in large part a focus on that self-awareness and on that introspection of different interactions and engagements to create a change, not at a surface because the policy says or because the company says I have to do it this way or they say this is the right way, but it really becomes a change on a neurophysiological level in those neural networks that says, oh, now I understand, or now I appreciate
Yeah.
this situation differently than I did before, that will naturally create a different outcome.
Yeah, because we're all human. So it's not like unique to any one particular person to feel confident or feel like someone's put them down, or everyone's been in this certain situations at least one time in their life. And so I think it's like you said, that self-reflection. Maybe people get to a certain level or certain role where maybe they're not as vulnerable as they felt they used to be, or they feel like they've developed some kind of an armor, or maybe they just forgot what it's like to be in certain types of positions, maybe one of less power, perceived less power. And so all of those things. And I have noticed that our leadership development training is getting more focused on those personality or this DISC test or those things where, because I think to be a good manager or leader, you have to know yourself and know your style and all those things first. So I'm glad to see that happening more, at least here, because you can't really effectively, I don't think, manage other people until you truly understand your own communication style and how it impacts other people too.
And I think though that I call that conceptual self-awareness. So that's your values, your strengths, your interests, your talents, knowing yourself. And that's really important. And that helps a lot. Most organizations do that to some degree. The
Yeah.
other half of it that I think is equally, if maybe not a little bit more important, is what I call embodied self-awareness. And this is the part that I think a lot of leaders and managers don't do, which is become really aware of the messages that are coming from their body, that the messages of their neural networks, their heart, their gut, their intuition, their instinct, their reaction, what's happening in different engagements. And and I think in my experience, it's like the idea that every leader or every manager can be toxic sometimes. I don't care how self-aware you are, we all have bad days and we all get triggered. And so those instances are going to happen. And it's a matter of how willing are we to really engage with ourselves around why did I react that way? Why did I have that response to that situation? How might it have been different? And most of the time, the root of those issues has nothing to do with what's going on in the exact situation. Most of the time, when a leader or a manager is responding in a toxic or unsafe way, there is a deep rooted trauma issue pattern
Mhm.
that's been triggered within them that's causing them to respond that way. And if we really want managers to become great leaders, great managers, we have to equip them and help them to eliminate those patterns, to deal with those challenges, because those are what are going to keep them stuck. Because it's when those unconscious patterns take over
Mhm.
and we're no longer consciously making a choice in how we respond or what we do. We're just falling into default mode. I'm frustrated, so I'm going to tell you how terrible you are as an employee because you didn't do what I told you to do. And I'm pissed because the thing's not going to be done on time and I'm triggered by that. And so rather than give meaningful feedback or be conscious in that communication, I'm allowing my dysregulation and my trigger to overwhelm it. And it's like all those types of situations that end up impacting people.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know at my previous company, we did a lot of training with leaders on unconscious bias. And there was a couple exercises she did because you can explain it, but until you have to recognize it in yourself. There's usually an aha moment, right? And that kind of, in my opinion, unlocks the door to further exploring these subconscious, unconscious things that you're doing, not just the ones that they say you should watch out for, but then you start putting this mirror on yourself. And I think a lot of us get to experience this as parents. Because when you were talking about these, I also felt like it's the same as being when you're a parent. You might bring your best self in certain days as a parent, but there might be days where you're just like snapping off to your kids and you're like, where is this coming from? You sit and you think, I sound just like my mom. What am I doing? And so you're right. I guess it would be interesting to learn more about how we can teach leaders or embed that into some training, so where they are becoming more, what did you call it, embodied?
Yeah,
Like,
and
self-aware?
embodied
Yeah,
self-awareness. Yeah.
yeah.
And what's interesting, unconscious bias, I once had a leader say he didn't have an unconscious biased bone in his body. And you know what? He's not wrong, because our biases don't live in our bones.
Yes, pass up.
Our biases are embedded in our neural networks. And they are, every single person has them and no one can avoid them,
Oh, yeah.
because we've each created our own neural pathways based upon our life experiences and environments. And by default, that means I have biased patterns. I have biased beliefs because my neural networks were created in a particular way. And I can only view and process the world through those neural networks. I cannot see them through someone else's. And as soon as we are willing to accept that, which is a scientific
Mhm.
explanation, not an opinion, right? That is just fact of how we develop as human beings in our bodies. And we recognize that this isn't about good or bad or how come I have unbiased. Every person has unconscious biases. And then when people realize that most of their everyday interactions, between 90 and 95% of our daily processes are unconscious. So we're only really consciously impacting between 5 and 10% of our days every day. So to say or to believe that our unconscious patterns aren't impacting us is just a false belief, because it's not how our bodies operate. And so when leaders become aware of this and they go, really 90 to 95% is unconscious? Yeah, because that's what's efficient and our bodies are wired to help survive. And so they're going to always use what's most efficient. They're going to default to those patterns. And I think when it comes to people awakening to this or becoming aware of this, those unconscious bias trainings like you talked about are a space where all of a sudden you realize what's there.
Mhm.
And that's the journey that leaders need to take where they become more self-reflective, where they become more questioning of their actions, their thoughts, their feelings. What is it that they're doing? Why are they doing it? Instead of just repeating the pattern, recognizing that there might be a pattern, and do they want to keep repeating that pattern? Is that pattern serving them? Is it helping them as a leader, as a manager, as a person or human being? Or is it getting in their way?
Yeah, it's a very interesting area. And I haven't seen, at least experienced it much being like required, right? Maybe just of top leaders or certain leaders or C-suite, but moving on down, it would be great to infuse that more into more everybody, really.
Yeah. That's my belief. Some of the stuff that I've
Mhm.
learned since, I always joke, I can't believe I went to school and I've been through so many trainings, and it took me until I was in my 40s to realize this valuable information that isn't hard. It actually isn't like super complicated. You don't have to be a super deep thinker. I can do this with my 5-year-olds and my 8-year-olds and teach them this, right? Like, it's just that we're not exposed to it. And
Right.
once we become aware of, oh, I might have experienced the situation this way, but my friend or my coworker or someone else might have experienced it very differently, it can change the outcome of our interactions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've always been so interested in human behavior. And I don't know if it's because my father is a psychologist, but I just always find it so interesting how people approach, react, think to similar and same circumstances. And some of these things you were saying, people that are more self aware in these ways tend to be able to master themselves a little bit better. And yeah, and you're right. I don't know if it's just because it wasn't brought to the forefront much, but I guess better late than never. We're figuring these things out, but how do you get that down to people in younger ages and getting to recognize that? And certain courses maybe they're taking in college or different self-help books. You've probably seen it more because you're studying it, but
And
this is
I'm recognizing that I think it's not something that is necessarily been part of the common curriculum or the common space. And interestingly enough, it is also the most impactful, and it's also the fastest at creating change. So rather than continuing to try to train and develop and coach and keep working with people and not getting them anywhere, when we access this and when we really understand this well, we can create massive change much more quickly. This has been great. You and I could probably go on for a really long time. I want to give you a chance to give any final thoughts, any observations you want to leave for our listeners today as we wrap this up.
no, this has been great. I wasn't exactly sure how the podcast would go, but I do love this format. I think it's a great idea. So if you keep going with it, neuroscience is a very, gosh, such an interesting topic. Like you said, more needs to come out about it. And I saw you had a guest that was part of a learning organization. And I think the more that we can infuse these types of concepts and ideas, get them more into learning and development, I think too, people will also respond more to that. Talking about engaging people or their actual experience at work, one of the things that we can all think of to do, and that sounds like a very impactful one, right? If we come away from one course that we've taken through our jobs, even, or that makes us want to explore that, and we actually get some value out of that, it's not just impacting our work lives, it's impacting our personal lives, right? And so
Yep.
it would be great to see more organizations trying to, and probably at their L&D level, right? Getting that infused somewhere along the way. So I think that's great and a great thing to think about for another topic.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's our purpose here with this podcast and with wanting to get out that message of that when we focus on our neural networks, when we understand how the human body works, how that can impact all different areas of leadership and workplace culture. And that when we do that, we can create better leaders. We can create leaders that are able to really connect to and relate to and develop people more effectively. So thank you so much, Monica, for coming on today. I'm so grateful for all of your wisdom and insight. And to all of our listeners, I just want to remind you to always keep evolving, keep growing, keep rewiring those neural networks so that you can live your best life, an exceptional life. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will be back again with another episode.